Thank you very much. The title of my short lecture is Architecture in Society, Society in Architecture. And I think the program committee should have given me at least 1 hour. I've only been given 15 minutes, but the topic is very, very big. But let me say first, architecture is about who we are and what forms of life we want to lead. And as a consequence, architects should have a much stronger and more visible position in contemporary society. And I think today is a good occasion to discuss just this issue. As has been said already, 2011 is the year of architecture. The Norwegian Architects Association, with 4,300 members, celebrates its first 100 years, and today is the day of architecture. And today your very interesting 10 days festival of architecture also starts stimulating for those who are able to do so to attend to competent architects discussing the role of architecture in today's society. And that is not as much the aesthetical sides of architecture, but its function and role in society, increasingly influenced by social, cultural, political and environmental factors. And as I understand it, a key question in this festival will be just this: how do all these demands influence and change processes of design and reasoning in contemporary architecture? And please forgive me if I should fill the next few minutes that I've been given with only banal or too simple insights. My short remarks are no more than a glance from the outside, an interested glance at that, but not a very informed or internal perspective. I only want to raise a couple of questions relating to architecture in society and society as it deposits itself in architecture from an engaged observer standpoint and in a Norwegian context, as I have been challenged to do. Architecture is frozen music, wrote the German author Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, some of you will know that he himself, with pride, called himself an architect during an important period of his life. Wittgenstein put it like this: architecture is really, most of all, a working on oneself, on how one looks at things and what one expects from them. As a youngster in a small, dusty industrial town in western Norway, I myself now and then dreamt a little of becoming an architect later in life. At least it was a daydream. Imagine leaving behind buildings, something physical, permanent, that is to be used by human beings every single day, for years and perhaps decades, constructions that people can enter into and live their whole lives inside. Well, I never became an architect, but instead many years later as a newspaper editor, I know that just architecture is one of the topics that interest Norwegian readers, ordinary citizens, more than most other issues. But why really? I think the reason is that architecture is about values, about identity. Aesthetics is about ethics, expresses ethics, shapes ethics, and mirrors ethics. And this is the reason why we in a newspaper write reportage about new buildings, review them and comment upon them. A shopping mall, a library in the suburbs, a brand new church, a renovated mega bookstore. Just to mention a few examples from Aftenposten's cultural pages the last months. We write about form, function, quality and qualities. And we are concerned about quite different things than what entrepreneurs and developers claim in their own marketing. Or we try to be. But how then does architecture today influence our society? It does so, of course, as an imperative part of our physical environments and as an important part of a building sector and industry that only this country has a turnover of more than 300 billion Norwegian kroner every year. Regardless of whether it is brilliant or mediocre, it stays with us for years and decades as manifestations of who we are or who we would like to be. In this way, architecture has a sort of potential, or should have a sort of potential, to be a critical instance in a society and to play a part in shaping that same society, in theory, that is. But when it comes to realities, I think we must admit that Norwegian architecture today is more of a mirror, a response, a reflex of the society surrounding it. And this situation is partly caused by much more stringent and tougher requirements and stronger pressure from developers to design, for example, buildings in such a way that more and more square meters can be built at the lowest possible cost. The result is much mediocre and some very bad architecture in this country, and this is sad for a nation like Norway. And the public position of architecture in our media society is severely weakened by architects themselves, even though there are some small positive signs that this could now be changing in such forums as the magazines Arkitektnytt and Arkitektur N. But these are read by very few outside the business. In Norwegian public cultural life in general, architects are some of the most passive agents of all. They too often seem like both an anxious and an introvert guild, a strange situation given the fact that architecture itself is in a very high degree a very visible and extrovert activity. But how often do you see architects themselves being interviewed or having their own texts published? Far too seldom. And quite a few of them write very poor texts themselves, when they do at all. But I almost never do, as I know. Their language overloaded by academic formulas, airy poetical formulations, or introverted tribal language, as Karinina Krishat, head of communication at the Norwegian Architects Association, points out in the latest issue of Arkitektnytt. But equally serious is the fact that Norwegian architects almost never dare to criticize each other and each other's work publicly. That happens almost solely behind closed doors. Is the explanation that they compete too intensely with each other and therefore develop mentalities as those found inside closed guilds, as architecture critic Erling Dockholm once pointed out? Well, maybe. But an even more important reason, I think, is that architecture is not a free and independent profession, if anyone should live under that illusion in 2011. And why? Architects fear more than anything to be disdained and disliked by developers and building companies. Their position is very strong, stronger than ever, at least in a country like Norway. They choose their architects, and they settle the budgets. They turn their fingers up or down for the architects, as Jan Carlsen pointed out in a recent discussion. But I'm sure you know all of these mechanisms much better than me. And perhaps you even want to falsify them. But yes, all of this makes a certain degree of self-censorship and introversion and invisibility of architects rather understandable, if not totally necessary, perhaps. But as a result, a handful of independent writers and scholars are too often the only participants in some of the most important discourses a society conducts about its architecture. And this is a regrettable fact, for they are not representative for all. And both architecture and society has much to lose on this. The architects lose influence, and ordinary citizens and the public lose insight into the factors and mechanisms that shape our surroundings. And even though you are a profession whose results, as we agree, I'm sure, are more visible than most other groups, I think I sense a considerable degree of arrogance from architects towards public opinion and ordinary citizens. In 2011 in Norway, too many architects shun everything that has to do with taste and judgment. For example, what should be regarded as beautiful or ugly. In this way, an alienation is created, a gap between architects and other citizens. And we have witnessed just this gap with Lambda, the winner of the Munch competition in Oslo. Regardless of what one thinks of it, if it is brilliant or or not, one must admit that it has never gained any comprehensive popularity, neither among Norwegian citizens nor among politicians. And that is a big problem. Again, regardless of whether one thinks it should be realized. It is really a big problem. And this gap between architects and citizens might now stop the whole project from being realized as one of the factors contributing to stopping it. And this is a sign of the increased and increasingly complex demands from society upon architects, I think. But on the other hand, simple populism is not what should lead and advise architecture. Needless to say, it doesn't necessarily create good results to let a combination of fear towards the provoking and innovative, and the quest for the safe and familiar rule and decide. I like something the main architect behind the new National Museum for Arts in Oslo, Klaus Schowerk, said in an interview recently. He doesn't really care what the general public says and thinks the day the new building opens, but what they say as time goes by. Quote, "If people like the museum in 50 years' time, then we have succeeded." So this is a complex matter. I've asked in what ways architecture might influence society today, and now I want to turn the question around. How does society influence architecture? How do the conflicting interests that architects are always surrounded by in a society express themselves, and how are they processed? And does Norway's government really have something like a politics of architecture? Well, there exists a plan dating from 2009, and it is followed up to a certain degree. But it surely must be one of the least discussed parts of Norwegian politics, in stark contrast to the incredible importance of architecturally designed surroundings for our development as a society. And one consequence of this is that the potential of architecture as a force taking part in building a society is unresolved, for example, as part of health politics. And the same goes for architecture as contributing to a sustainable development. This is often highlighted as an ideal, but in reality, most architecture is still planned in a very traditional and energy-demanding way. Regardless of all this, the public interest in architecture is very comprehensive. And after the terror in Norway on July 22nd, the interest in our common spaces has increased, especially these spaces, which became very important and unifying in the weeks immediately following the terror. Gathering in public physical space in Oslo and all around this country helped changing Norway a little bit for a little while. Everyday life is here again now, in Oslo, where tens of billions of Norwegian kroner are invested, and several projects are being realized in just a few years' time. The situation now is characterized by complex political processes and new rounds of discussions, as the mayor pointed to. And the future, the uncertain future of the new Munch Museum is just one example. But Norwegian architecture is so much more than the never-ending fights around the prestigious public buildings in the capital. A much graver problem, perhaps, is lack of planning concerning the physical environments in many Norwegian municipalities. All over the country, better local plans have to be established to improve today's often miserable and random solutions, especially in smaller and mid-sized municipalities. So my claim is that the very deepest problem connected to Norwegian architecture today is how everyday architecture is realized by public and private agencies, for example, schools, hospitals, private homes. There is reason to celebrate the first-class architecture that is being carried out in Norway today, both public projects and private houses that gain very well-deserved international reputation. But there is much, much more that lacks ambitions and will be forgotten in a few years' time. The high demand for housing leads both the market and decision-making bodies to set demands for quality to the side, and this creates areas planned without holistic perspectives, building in too small plots and creating outdoor areas in our cities that are less attractive. And what does all this do to life within the walls and between the houses? Expenses might be reduced today, but society's economics will suffer in later decades when many of these questionable buildings will have to be renovated, rehabilitated, or torn down. More than anything else, I think we need a more comprehensive, popular, and citizen involvement in projects before decisions are made. Whether you like it or not, this is essential in an open, democratic, and highly educated society that demands so much more from its architecture than earlier. Architects should have a mandatory role and function in explaining their projects in a thorough and pedagogical manner, in order that we can all criticize, evaluate, and improve on them before political decisions are made and construction work starts. This is done only randomly today, and much too seldom. In that way, we really need new ways of communicating architecture, to say goodbye to the tribal language and the very pompous ways of discussing architecture. And this is essential because architecture belongs to the community at large, not to the developers and not to you architects. To communicate architecture to ordinary citizens should become a more important part of education and of every public building process. And to reach this goal, even a small country like Norway needs a small army of offensive architects that dare to think aloud and freely about their profession. And I think this is the only way we can realize and live up to Winston Churchill's banal but nevertheless deep insight about the relation between architecture and society, between society and architecture. We shape our buildings, then they shape us. Thank you.